We'll now move to more concrete discussions on different regions of the world. We have an eminent panel of researchers here. My name is John Karlsrud. I'm with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. We have Morten Bøås, also a colleague from NUPI, who will talk about, I think, mainly Sahel. We have Ellen Kjønneland, who's from the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, CMI, and who will talk about Southern Africa, I think, mostly, or Somalia. Sorry. And Julia Palik, who will talk about, who is from PRIO and will talk about Yemen. She's online. So I think in the order of the program, who is on top of that program?
Julia.
Julia. Okay, so we'll start with you, Julia.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me, and I'm very sorry that I cannot be there in person. So I was listening to the first half of this conversation, which was extremely interesting, and thank you very much for everyone to provide some practitioner background and interesting information about how this whole topic affects the daily life of humanitarian actors. So when I was asked to provide some reflections on how humanitarian action and counterterrorism essentially unfolds in Yemen, I thought that Linda has already provided some interesting information and details regarding the contemporary effects of counterterrorism legislation in Yemen. But I thought it would be important to take a step back and think about the early 2000s, when after 9/11, Yemen became a forerunner and a forefront cooperative partner of the US in the global war on terror. Now, what it means is that at that time, the president was Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, who was deposed in 2011, and he received considerable amount of counterterrorism aid in terms of both money and military training. Now, part of this money, now this is a very well-documented case, has been misused not to fight Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but to counter different other non-state actors, such as the Houthis, or at that time the Southern movement, the Southern Independence Movement. So I think this is important to keep in mind that although countries and states can be and are often partners in counterterrorism work, they might and sometimes also misuse this type of aid for their own strategic interests. So this is more of a structural consequence. This can be more of a structural consequence of counterterrorism aid in such weak institutional countries as Yemen. And the second point I wanted to make in this brief reflection is concerns again more the operational environment, as Linda and Trygve was reflecting on, which refers to, for example, a very interesting and although not that unique case anymore, that for a brief while in 2020, at the end of the Trump administration, Trump designated the Houthis to foreign terrorist organization. And the problem with that was the Houthis, as of now, control approximately 70% of the country, which means that in case this legislation would have been a long-term one, this would have meant that humanitarian organizations wouldn't have access to majority of the country, whereas in other cases where foreign terrorist organization labeling enters into the picture, this often concerns a relatively smaller population and smaller group. And another last point that I just want to throw in, and I would be very interested in hearing the reflections of the other panelists and then people in the audience, also concerns the very difficult trade-offs and considerations that humanitarian actors have to face and make and think about when we think about the donors to humanitarian aid and their role in certain conflicts, as this is a very prevalent case in terms of Yemen, where the Saudis and the UAE are the main humanitarian donors alongside with the UK and the US, but they are also the ones who are responsible for much of the destruction that is ongoing in this country. And I will leave this here now and looking forward to listening to the other panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for a very good introduction to the Yemeni case. Morten, could you bring us to the Sahel?
Can I bring you to the Sahel? Well, you'll see. I think that what we're currently seeing in the Sahel, and particularly in Mali, I was in Mali and Niger and Burkina throughout October, and I mean the situation is getting increasingly both brutal as a war, but also increasingly messy, I would say. And I think that Mali, in a way, illustrates the messiness of contemporary asymmetrical war and how and in what way, if possible, humanitarian actors can operate in such a situation. Because on one side, we have a government that after two coups, the first in August, that was a real coup, August 2020, and then the palace coup of May 2021, is increasingly authoritarian, but quite popular, particularly in Bamako, where their anti-French, anti-UN rhetoric is quite well received. And that's, in a way, one can understand, because, I mean, Malians thought that when the UN and French intervened in 2013, they thought that they were going to solve this. And they really cannot understand why the UN, with 13,000 personnel, France with Operation Barkhane, around 3,000 to 3,500, really cannot solve this. What they are seeing is that the conflict is getting worse. And of course, people have to try to find out why is that happening, which leads to a lot of, if it hadn't been so sad, quite entertaining stories about why the UN and France really are there. So that's one side of this. I mean, that also all international actors are in one way or another also tainted by this, although people still sort of separate between humanitarian, some of the non-governmental humanitarian actors and the more sort of international EU, France, UN actors. And on the other hand, I mean, you have and this government has an army that is still operational in some sort, but well, its human rights record is not impressive, to put it mildly. So these are sort of the international society's allies in this case. On the other side of the coin is jihadi insurgents inspired by Al-Qaeda, others by the Islamic State, plus a multitude of very local self-defense militias, and also quite a lot of government-aligned militias. Few of these actors take humanitarian principles serious in any way. So this is sort of where they have to try to operate. And can one operate impartially in such an environment? Well, to me, the answer is no, it's not possible. It's not possible, but also that access must constantly be negotiated. And the negotiation of access here is becoming more problematic. It's becoming more problematic, not locally, because negotiations is in fact part of the sort of sticking stone and conflict between the new rulers in Mali, that is Amathou Goïta and Choguel Maïga, President and Prime Minister. Part of their conflict with Macron is over negotiations. There is quite a, of course, impossible to know for certain, but at least in Bamako, there seems to be quite a strong support for negotiations with all armed groups that they define as Malian. So they draw a line between the Malian and the non-Malian jihadi groups. This is the red line of Macron. He is completely obsessed with particular two figures, Yada Ghali and Hamadou Koufa, which he wants to kill and has tried repeatedly, but not successfully. And then there is an other red line looming on the horizon here, and that is the role of the Wagner Group, because there is a conflict also over Barkhane, the French operation. France want to what they call Barkhane reformulé, which nobody really understands what actually is, but at least the Malians have understand that Barkhane is moving its headquarters from Bamako to Niamey in Niger, and they are extremely unhappy about this, and say that if so happen, they will bring in the Wagner Group. Then all Western donors, in Norway included, has said that this is the red line. If this happens, there will be no more development assistance. It will be only humanitarian assistance. This will also, of course, has tremendous effects for the humanitarian assistance and humanitarian access, because the Malians is not going to take this kindly, to put it mildly. This also means that these constant negotiations of local access will become much more problematic. There is, as I said, I mean, it's negotiation, humanitarian negotiation, particularly in central Mali, in the Mopti and Segou area, is constantly negotiated, both with jihadi actors, but also with self-defense militias, with the DOSUs, with government-aligned militias. And into these negotiations, one also, of course, has to bring in the Malian army in one way or another. So all of these actors are involved in a complex conversations around local access. Sometimes successful, if successful means that humanitarian actors get humanitarian access. But none of these agreements last very long, and they tend to be extremely sort of local specific. There has been talks and attempts about sort of trying to scale this up to a larger regional level. That has so far been completely unsuccessful. So what one is left with here is what has become a war that is getting closer and closer to Bamako. I mean, most people think that the jihadi actors now are trying to encircle Bamako, and the reason why they don't attack Bamako with any kind of showcase attack is basically because it's not in their interest right now. And this also means that, of course, the jihadis themselves are getting bolder, and it becomes more difficult to negotiate access with them. So what this is becoming is a brutal rolling war, where neither side care much for be it collateral damage or protection on humanitarian grounds, and it becomes increasingly complex negotiations on all possible levels, from the large-scale sort of high negotiation between Mali, ECOWAS, AU, UN and France, down to this multitude of actors involved in very complex local negotiations over access to increasingly location-specific areas. And I think this is something, we are seeing this in Mali, we are seeing this in the Tillaberi in Niger, we are seeing this also now in Burkina. It's a pattern that we will continue to see in this theater of war, but also in other theaters of wars, unfortunately. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Morten. It's a kind of a bleak picture that you're painting. We'll move on to Somalia with the Ellington Land.
Thank you. I am also coming to this agenda from a bit from the outside. I'm more interested in, or more preoccupied with the links between humanitarian action and development work and reconstruction and so on. So that will be my take on it. I'll use the case of Somalia, where I haven't done much work on the humanitarian side, but examine the Norwegian engagement in Somalia and try and use that to come up with some important dilemmas and challenges that's also relevant beyond that. But perhaps first I should say that my very first encounter with humanitarian issues was in my very much younger days, in the late 70s. And it was linked to refugees from South Africa into the ANC camps in various African countries, Angola and Tanzania. And the foreign ministry was providing humanitarian aid to those camps and to the ANC refugees. And in those days, the debate was, are they terrorists or freedom fighters? So that is one important lesson. Somebody's hero is somebody else's terrorist. And in those days, the support was motivated not so much by humanitarian needs. There was no talk about humanitarian principles of neutrality, etc. It was about solidarity. The one thing we didn't understand in those days was, which we understand now because we all have to go through the training courses and the manuals about conflict sensitivity, was that if you go support a camp, you also have to think about the surrounding communities, which you didn't think about in those days. So we learn. But then Somalia. Somalia is a country, 16 million people, about half of them in need of humanitarian aid, according to the most recent assessment. The drivers of the conflict, as you know, is It's partly political violence between the federal government in Mogadishu and Islamic rebels in the Al-Shabaab, but it's also, and very importantly, tensions, conflicts between the central government, the federal government, and member states. And then you have clan rivalries. And to add to the mix, we have a series of quite severe climate shocks linked to drought, floods, you have diseases. All of these play together and has turned Somalia into an ongoing humanitarian catastrophe. Norway has engaged with that country on a systematic level since our previous membership of the Security Council. Then Norway was a member of the, was a pen holder on Somalia. That dragged Norway into the international contact group on Somalia and high politics, and that led to an expanding engagement in Somalia. And with the establishment of a first central government in Somalia in 2012, the federal government in Mogadishu. Norway was a pioneer in providing support for what was essentially a state building and stabilization exercise in Somalia. And that has been a dominant feature of Norway's engagement. Ever since today, we give about 500-600 million Norwegian kroner a year to the country. Of this, about 25% or so is what we can call strictly humanitarian aid. The rest is for other purposes. And the dominant thing is state building stabilization. And is it, just a footnote to John's earlier remark, there hasn't been a tendency in the Norwegian engagements to reduce the focus on state building in favor of expanding humanitarian. It's more the other way around, actually, in the case of Somalia. That has led to, let me say, there are three dilemmas, three challenges that we are faced with in, well, there are more, but I'll highlight three. One is the humanitarian principle of protection assistance. I think all assessments and lessons from the Norwegian engagement is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its humanitarian section has been quite flexible in accommodating requests from those on the ground. They provided the funding timely. It has largely been unearmarked, which is a good principle. A main challenge has been access to what in the terminology is called the hard-to-reach areas, which is essentially the Al-Shabaab controlled areas, or areas which are partly controlled by Al-Shabaab. Norway has been able to support humanitarian relief into those areas through the main channels that I use, which is essentially the UN and the Norwegian Refugee Council, and also the Red Cross. And the Red Cross works with the Somali Red Crescent, which has access all over the countries. But the one impression is that the Norwegian NGOs, or the channels used, they have transferred the risks to local partners. And it's the local partners that's been able to access the hard-to-reach areas, the Al-Shabaab controlled areas. And the one important message that I take from this is the issue of localization and the extent to what you're able to work with your local partners. I think Norwegian NGOs and so on has been quite good at doing that when it comes to development work, but at least when it comes to the big ones. I think it remains a challenge in humanitarian relief. There, one has not really been able to make solid progress when it comes to building up capacity with local partners. That was one dilemma. The second one, which is very much highlighted in Norwegian government policy documents and strategies, also in the humanitarian one, and especially in the case of Somalia is to provide a link between humanitarian aid, relief, and resilience. And that's really where a lot of the money has gone into. And I've highlighted in the Norwegian case, education, health, but above all, what they call climate smart agriculture. And the main channels for this has been NGOs, mainly Norwegian NGOs, and mainly the development focused NGOs. I think that's important, but it's also important to also highlight that they have not really been able to do that type of work in the so-called hard-to-reach areas. That is more in government-controlled areas, or partly government-controlled areas. Third dilemma is, how do you balance your state building and stabilization with the humanitarian relief work? Because while I have no problems in realizing the importance of actually getting a state up and running in that country, the federal government, or therefore supporting a federal government, is justified. But the federal government is also part of the problem. It's also an institution or a body that stimulates conflicts, which is now very much evidenced in the relations between Mogadishu and several of the member states, which has caused delays for quite some time in the holding of elections, which has made it nearly impossible to turn the nominally existent Somali National Army into a viable force, which makes it extremely difficult for the AU mission, the AMISOM, to withdraw. And if they were to withdraw today or tomorrow, we might very well see a kind of a Talibanization of Somalia. But they are there and are doing holding operations. And the federal government is not making it easier to build stability in that country. Thank you.
Thank you, Elin. And very complicated picture also in Somalia.
Yeah.
I think we'll turn to the audience, both online and then here physically. Here, if you have some questions and comments, please. Yes.
Yes, so thank you very much for a very interesting, very different cases. But underlying some of these cases is the question also of new emerging powers in humanitarianism. And that's something I don't think we've really discussed today, and how that politicization of humanitarianism will play out. And I was wondering particularly about something that, Morten, you said about using the Wagner Group. Do you think it'll get to the point where states who are worried about some of the conditionalities that come with multilateral assistance will rather prefer bilateral assistance with new emerging powers who don't have the same conditionalities and perhaps have a more politicized approach? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps there are similar comments.
Okay, thank you. Great question. Just to a certain extent, it's to be seen, right? But again, I mean, doing on another project, doing a lot of interviews with various sort of parts of the, how do you say, concerned Malian society about the EU's programming in Mali, which has been immense. I mean, one great Malian intellectual, Osman Sy, said that to me, that we have become the laboratory for European development assistance and humanitarian assistance, he said. And I think Osman was more right than he probably imagined at that time, because what we are seeing in Mali now is some sort of laboratory of all of these things, including the role also of conflicts between a government and its traditional allies / donors. There is and it's a conflict that is sort of almost increasing in level during this autumn from week to week, where Maiga and Goita, I mean, if you want to see how this is played out, look at the exchanges between France and Mali in the UN Assembly this autumn, where they basically went to great lengths to talk badly about each other. But you also see this, how a country like Mali is now trying to sort of operate within a completely new, or not completely new, but what should we say, a slightly transformed landscape of which consists of a combination of new countries seeking political influence, access to something they find of interest in this country, and at the same time using the Malian conflict as a little pawn in a much larger geostrategic game. And within this landscape in Mali, I mean, Russia is not a new actor, but Russia is back on the scene in a way that they haven't been for a long time in Africa. Russia is back on the scene, trying to sort of, and what Russia is doing is not so different from what other new actors, both humanitarian, but also sort of new state-building actors, but also actors who have their own specific economic and political interest. Morocco is involved in much of the same way. Algeria is now trying to get involved because they see that Morocco is so involved. So in a way, Mali has also been drawn into the conflict between the ancient conflict between Morocco and Algeria. Turkey is there, and so on and so forth, all trying to sort of not, and what separates these new actors, quote unquote, new actors from sort of, how we say, the European approach, if we can talk about such, is that they are actively seeking different, so what I call niche markets here. Russia, with perhaps the Wagner Group, we don't know yet. It's been thrown onto the table by Maiga and Goita. Nobody knows if an agreement in fact has been negotiated or is in the process of being negotiated, or whether it's just something they threw on this poker table between them and Macron, just to sort of increase the bid, so to speak. I mean, if you play this card, we'll play the Wagner card. What do you do then? We don't know, but I mean, there you have this niche market of sort of security against various sort of barter deals, basically. But if Wagner think it's going to be rich from gold in Mali, I think that the Wagner is wrong, but that's another matter. Morocco is sort of playing its cards, which is a combination of some foreign direct investment, some minor humanitarian assistance, plus, not the least, how it is involved in the religious field, with bringing Malian imams to Rabat for training in the what Morocco presents as sort of its moderate modern Islam. Turkey is involved in this. I mean, it becomes an even more complicated game, because it's shifting the game from sort of this, what used to be the game with regard to development assistance, humanitarian assistance, which was basically more sort of wholesale negotiations, talks, discussion about programs, projects on a more national wide scale, down to very sort of specific issues. Again, one could talk about also this as some sort of process of localization of negotiations around anything from state building, if you can talk, if you include security into that pot, which I think we should, down to the role of religion and religious affairs and imams, and how they are to preach, where they are to preach, and so on and so forth. And in the midst of this is also trading issues, airline connections and concession, the role of Royal Air Maroc, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Morten. I'll just throw in, because I would like to ask also Elling and Julia about new actors and their impact. So how does this also impact on the state building kind of model that is being followed? Is it changing it from a kind of the liberal model to a more authoritarian model? What is acceptable options on the ground?
On the state building model,
So first talking about the external actors and new actors.
Let's begin at a different end. And thank you for your questions. Turkey and China in particular are the very important new global actors, also actively engaging in Somalia. Turkey in particular is a major commercial player and political player in the country, working also closely with the federal government. China is, and that applies to when it comes to Turkey, also to the rest of the Horn of Africa. China is important on the Horn of Africa, not so much in Somalia. He has tried to engage commercially, but has burned their fingers and has been a bit more marginal compared to the role in other countries. Both are, however, both Turkey and China are keen to support the federal government and to ensure stability built around that government. And the immediate question that I will have to address is the future of the AU, the AMISOM, the AU military operation in peacekeeping force in Somalia. The challenge there is funding. Traditional funders like the EU in particular want to cut back on their support, and the Security Council is likely to renew its mandate for another 6 months or so. But the question is funding, and now the big issue, will the AU be able to get others to step in and provide cash support to the AU force? And the primary candidates are Turkey and China, and I don't know how and to what extent they will. That mainly was with China, but that is actually and there is a certain urgency to it also because of the crisis in Ethiopia. Both countries have so vested interests in that country, and they can't simply ignore that things fall apart. And China in particular, they have invested heavily in terms of loans, and if Ethiopia can't service those loans, I mean, particularly the railways and the harbour development in Djibouti and so on, you are in. China is above all try to avoid what happened in Libya, where they lost billions and billions overnight and had to evacuate 13,000 Chinese with the fall of Gaddafi. They would like to avoid that. So they are sort of dragged into it. But they are to be watched, and they are playing an important role, in particular Turkey. Although none of them have been engaged specifically on the humanitarian side. That's also important, but I've been engaged at the political side. There's one dimension that I would like to say, and that is it's not just the global actors, there are also regional actors. And Somalia is located where it is located, surrounded by a number of countries, which also have interests in the outcome of what happens there. And they have different interests. And the peculiar thing about this African Union force is that it's composed of troops from the neighboring countries. And that is really a major problem for the force. There is a small contingent from Sierra Leone, but the rest is dominated by Kenya and Ethiopia, which in addition to sending troops to the AMISOM is also having their own separate troop contingents in the country. And they are all engaging with different member states, all trying to play a political role via the federal government. So it's a messy situation. And with what's now happening in Ethiopia, the situation is not that good for any urgent stability in Somalia.
Thank you. Well, Julia, in Yemen, what's the situation with the new actors in the humanitarian domain? Do you have new countries coming in?
Thank you very much for this question, Pinar. I think as we've heard it from the other two cases, it is kind of a pertinent issue in a lot of places, especially China's role and other regional actors. Now, I want to reflect and maybe rephrase this a little bit regarding Yemen, because I think there are, other than China, not that many new actors in terms of aid providers. What is new, though, is the new type of level of institutionalization of this aid, because Saudi Arabia has always been historically been the main aid source of Yemen, although that is not necessarily, that hasn't necessarily been channeled in the way that we would understand in more Western countries. But Saudi Arabia for essentially 70 years had a special ministry for the management of Yemeni affairs, which was responsible also for disbursing monthly payments to certain tribal leaders. And this also involved development aid, what we understand as development aid to certain infrastructural programs. But since the conflict and since the military involvement from 2015 onwards of the Saudi-led coalition, Saudi Arabia simultaneously built up a humanitarian complex in Yemen. The King Faisal Relief Center that has been established in 2015 provides aid mostly to the leftover government-controlled areas. So this is one important consequence that I would like to highlight as in case of Yemen, what can happen and what my own research essentially shows is that there is an imbalance in terms of where aid goes, because the government-controlled southern territories are not necessarily the ones that are the more devastated. But this, in the long term, might also contribute to subnational inequalities that has always been quite prevalent in Yemen. So this is one thing to think about. And the other thing that I would like to connect the dots and what I find quite interesting, and I'm sure that the practitioners who are here in the audience and who are listening would have very interesting insights about this, that how humanitarian influence can be instrumentalized in the international level and translates into influence at the UN, for example. Because in case of Yemen, Saudi Arabia has not once, and now this became like a proven fact, not once threatened the UN Security Council that it's going to withdraw the humanitarian aid if the UN, for example, publishes a report in which Saudi Arabia is portrayed as a power who is recruiting child soldiers and also committing sexual abuse against children in the conflict. And hence, Saudi Arabia was left out from such a report. And most recently, what has been, I think, probably one of the most devastating international level developments in Yemen, the Yemen humanitarian, the panel of experts who was responsible for reporting on the human rights violations, its mandate hasn't been renewed. And part of the reason for that, this means that now there is an ongoing conflict where there is no international actor that is going to report anymore impartially on the, theoretically impartially, on the humanitarian abuses and human rights violations. Why? Because during a vote, 27 states voted against it, and although Saudi Arabia was not there, but most of the satellite states of Saudi Arabia, such as Bahrain, obviously under the influence of Saudi Arabia, voted against such an extension. And this is, I think, quite a concerning development. So I would like to, if I have to summarize what I've been saying, is one, the subnational level impact of such new actors and their type of humanitarian involvement, as well as their impact on the international level political dynamics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. I think, Morten, did you have one comment on this?
Just a brief comment, because you said something about, Jon, in your question to us about the liberal state model. And there is this claim now that sort of what we are seeing in the Sahel with particularly Mali, but also slightly sort of more authoritarian tendencies in Niger and Burkina, and the coup in Guinea, that we're now seeing sort of the end of liberal democracy for a while in this part of the world. But then I think we don't have to remember that democracy as a system of rule has to deliver. It has to deliver something. It doesn't, for people on the ground, it doesn't have a value in itself. It has a value if it delivers. And frankly, it hasn't delivered here, and that's why people are not. The coup in Mali was immensely popular, the one in August, because it got rid of what they saw was a completely corrupted regime, and it was a completely corrupted regime. And similarly, the one in Guinea was not also sort of relatively well received, and that is because these are regimes that simply has not delivered. So it's not that it's not against democracy as such, it's against a form of democracy that has not delivered anything. And democracy has to deliver to have a value. If it doesn't deliver, it doesn't have a value to people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have another question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Edward O'Donnell, and I'm from the United States, and I'm a professor at Arizona State University teaching courses on human rights and diplomacy and U.S. foreign policy. And I was formerly a U.S. diplomat for 30 some odd years. I never served in the three countries we're talking about today, but I'd like to ask a question about U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. bilateral aid, now headed by Samantha Power, who is known as a human rights activist and preventing genocide and so on, and of course, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And at the ground level in the three countries that we're talking about today, to what extent can organizations like yours, who are very important, work with USAID, U.S. embassies, local diplomats, the representatives at the grassroots level who are also trying to get U.S. bilateral aid to the people who need it? And especially, I think, Eileen, you talked about working with local groups. That sort of dilemma of working with local groups and avoiding getting involved in the corruption that's prevalent in a lot of these societies, unfortunately, at the grassroots level. How do you work with local groups, make sure scarce resource dollars get to the right people who are in need? And are there lessons learned, or is there cooperation at the grassroots level with people like development assistants, USAID representatives on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. I think we'll then, I don't know who wants to go first. Could I ask Julia, for example?
It's hard
to.
Thank you very
okay?
much.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I can go first, and I think it's quite a tricky question, so I'm very interested in the other panelists' responses. The first thing that comes to mind, and excuse me if I'm a little too critical, but I have to say this, I do not necessarily think that it's only local groups that are corrupt, but there is corruption in all levels, so I think it is important to recognize this. And how to select essentially the groups that are good to work with on the local level. I think the previous panel could have provided a very interesting answers to this. As an academic, I am not able to do that, but I can bring in one example that might be interesting, and I'm pretty sure that this is prevalent in other cases too. It certainly has been in Yemen. So we have talked about this in the previous session, that USAID and also the World Food Programme for a while halted their operations in the Houthi-controlled northern areas over concerns of access to population and also diversion of aid, because there is a whole black market for humanitarian aid in Yemen, which is partly the consequence of the counter-terrorism regulation, and also that everything became a cash-based system. But what I wanted to say as an example, and which is quite an interesting development throughout the years since 2001. The Houthi group is openly anti-American, and thus, when US aid convoys, for example, have been stationed in the north, they have very frequently been attacked, and simply the symbolic power of having a US flag or a US emblem in the territory of these groups can be of concern for them. And then in their mind, this is a legitimate target. And I think this highlights one interesting aspect of US foreign policy in Yemen, which hasn't really been an independent foreign policy, but always been the file together with the Gulf policy and mostly with the US's relationship to Saudi Arabia. So I think the American counter-terrorism strategy in Yemen has achieved tactical victories in terms of killing some prominent Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula leaders. But at the same time, for a very long time, and hopefully this might change with the Biden administration, there has been a strategic failure in Yemen in terms of US foreign policy. And the reason for that is the complete and only security focus on Yemen, and much less in terms of winning hearts and minds strategy, which has been only a recent development in US foreign policy towards Yemen. So I think these were my reflections to this very complex question, and especially the US's role in all this, what we are talking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. I don't know who of you would like to go first. Ellen, maybe?
Yeah, a few general remarks. I'm not that familiar with US aid in Somalia, so I can't specifically talk to that. So it will be at a more general level. My first point is that there are examples of Norway we've worked with USAID on specific project and programs, but it's been more at a more global level and at diplomatic level, also at the country level, not so much in joint projects on the ground, although there are many cases of USAID and, say, Norway supporting the same recipient also in Somalia. But when Norway has worked with other bilateral donors on the ground, it has mostly been some of the Nordics, the DFIDs of this world, Germany and so on, the more like-minded, if you can use that term, who share sort of similar outlooks and assessments. But it also has to do with operational modalities. USAID has a very different way of operating. It's much more difficult to channel funds through the USAID, and the USAID is much more difficult for them to channel funds through, say, for example, a Norwegian agency. And then the other problem or challenge is what in technocratic terms is the coherence issue. To what extent does your aid interventions also support and is aligned with and linked to your other engagement? In the case of Norway, it's primarily aid humanitarian engagement, and we throw our efforts into that. The US has a few more interests and a number of other instruments to use. In the case of Somalia, of course, they have their drones operating out of Djibouti and so on. So those are issues that come into play. But if you really look at the USAID and where it really can make a difference right now is, of course, when it comes to vaccines and COVID-19, where with the new leadership in USAID, they can, turn things around quite dramatically. And then a final comment on corruption local partners. And that is, of course, the argument that it's difficult to localize and to transfer responsibility because there's a risk of corruption. And that's a real problem. But I don't think the response is to withdraw from working with partners. I think that if a Norwegian NGO, I shall not mention names, get a 5-year contract to deliver in a country, and your local partner get a 3-month contract because they don't really trust them to, be in charge of a multi-year project. So ongoing short-term contracts has often been the response to that, but that undermines the ambitions of building up your capacity. And then as more than corruption that leads to funds not reaching those really in needs. And the international NGOs and other agencies, of course, they spend a fortune on working with local business communities that supply the goods, that supplies the security, and it's the main source of income for very powerful economic elites in those countries. And that also has a very negative impact on your ability to deliver humanitarian aid and development on the ground.
Thank you, Elvin.
Yes. Let me start by the US before I move down to US aid, and then some thoughts about corruption, and finally a little bit about the vaccines. The US has an enormously large embassy in Bamako, but there is not a huge US presence in Mali. And I think that's very deliberate. I mean, I think the US, first under Obama and then under Trump and now under Biden, basically tries to stay out of this part of Africa and sees this as something that they can leave to the Europeans to sort out. To the extent that the US itself is involved, it is through the drone base that has been built in Agadez in the north of Niger. Otherwise, it's sort of very hard to see any strategic involvement from the US as such. Of course, it may change if Russia gets more on the ground, maybe. That said, I mean, US aid is there, and it is an actor that spends a lot of money. And it's also running a number of, it has provided also money for a number of sort of not only humanitarian or development assistance, but also for a sort of research and reconciliation projects. If I should give only advice to USAID in that regard, is that you have to think about the absorption capacity in Mali. And that is not only a problem for USAID, but it's a huge problem for a number of donors, including also some of the non-governmental organizations involved, because the absorption capacity in Mali is so low. So it's not necessarily a matter of just spending money. It's about perhaps spending less, more wisely. And just one example of this is a couple of years ago, a huge US-funded program was launched that was supposed to work in what is now the most conflict-affected areas, that is central Mali, and Mopti in particular. I warned my local colleagues in Mali to stay the hell out of that project, because it was way too large, it was way too much money too soon, and way too complicated, because the financial reporting procedures of USAID is immensely complicated. And this was bound to end in nothing and in a financial disaster. And that is precisely what it did. They tried to do way too much too soon with some of the most complicated financial reporting procedures that the world of development assistance has ever seen, in my point of view. And then you need to think scale, you need to think absorption capacity when you're doing this. And I think that I believe that the US now is also involved in this John Stuart Mill project that is basically being run out of, they say that it's the UK that is behind it, but there is also US money in it. There they have tried another business model by basically setting up the John Stuart Mill company, but it's going to end in the same thing, I think, local. Corruption, I mean, Mali is immensely corrupt, and it's going to get worse because people are now feeling that it's the end of times, basically. I mean, they are seeing that the jihadi rebels are getting closer and closer to the capital, and you just need to do whatever you can to put as much money in your pocket before everything falls. That means that everything from petty police corruption to large-scale corruption is increasing and likely to increase more, and the level of impunity is still immensely high. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was sitting at the Hotel Badala. Next to our table was a bunch of French intelligence officers. We were talking to a guy from one of the leaders from Gaita, that is one of the platform, sort of government-aligned militias. And he very openly and quite loudly talked about Gaitas and his involvement in drug trafficking. And he didn't care at all that the French intelligence officer sitting almost next to us had heard everything he said. Why is that? Because he knew that it had absolutely no consequences for him. So how do you engage with this? I mean, you have to engage again wisely, but non-engagement is not going to help at all. I mean, yes, I agree with Elling. I mean, the state here, like in Somalia, it's very much part of the problem, but it's almost impossible to envision any solution without an engagement with this state. So you need to engage with it, and you simply have to accept it for what it is now, and pretending that it's something else by saying, I have a zero tolerance to corruption. If you have a zero tolerance to corruption, you have to go somewhere else than Mali. You have to go somewhere else. It's simply not possible to operate there and say that I have a zero tolerance to corruption. At certain times, you have to look the other way, because if you don't look the other way, you have nobody to work with, period. So, but the way that the international community and the sort of signal sent by the European Union, which many other donors has followed, is at least completely avoid corruption. They have said that if they are to engage with a Malian civil society organization, it has to have, I don't remember the actual size of it, but they have to have quite a substantial annual operating budget on their own, which more or less exclude all local level Malian civil society organizations for involvement with the European Union. And this is not the way to go. I mean, if you want to reduce corruption, at least take it down to the level where what you will be left with is more petty corruption, which will be in the more local organizations, in my point of view. So it's impossible to give an answer to this, but the only answer one can give is that if you care about these areas of the world at all, if you don't want to see them fall any further down with consequences that this will have. And for example, here, I mean, if Mali falls, I mean, Burkina will go, and then Niger will also probably go, and then we are left with a huge black hole in an area which is quite close to the Mediterranean shore. So I mean, it's basically in our own interest to try to avoid that happening. Well, then we need to keep that engagement and try to engage as wisely as possible. And remember this about our observation capacity, and remember that it's not necessary. If we are to help Mali, it's not necessarily about spending more money, but spending more wisely.
Thank you, Morten. I'll take your questions now.
Yes, thank you. I had a very quick...
You have to come up here again, sorry. It's a bit complicated.
Are you Ellie? I had a very quick follow-up question to Ellie in relation to the vaccine point. That you were saying what has changed might change at USAID was in relation to the vaccines, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate. And it links us a bit inevitably to the other conversations we were having this morning in terms of the impact, possibly, maybe I'm reading through the lines, of counter-terrorism measures on humanitarian action, because one question that I've been grappling with is vaccine availability for people under the control of groups that are designated as terrorists. So I don't know if this is what you were hinting at.
That's an interesting question. Thank you. Elling?
On vaccines, well, as you know, the challenge is that we don't have much distribution of COVID vaccines in Africa. They are way behind, and those that could make a difference has not really made the necessary donations. USAID could make a difference. It's a signal that it wants to engage more on this with a new USAID boss. And I haven't followed the debate, so I don't know what has come of it. But I'm thinking about George W. Bush, who is really not a hero of Africa, but he did one thing, and that was the Millennium Fund that he established in 2000, and that run from the president's office, from the White House, and that really provided the funds to ensure that medicines became affordable, medicines became accessible throughout the continent. And it was that fund, rather than anything else, that really made a big difference in combating AIDS, HIV/AIDS. So something like that could possibly happen, although the indications, as far as I know, has not been that good when it comes to actually delivering in relations to COVAX from USAID. Just last week, I noticed that, as a footnote, that China made a new promise. We will deliver 600 million vaccines to Africa. The Chinese president made that promise at the FOCAC summit in Senegal last week.
Thanks. Morten?
Just very quickly on this. I mean, a year ago, it was quite a lot discussed this, that there was an emerging vaccine diplomacy. Well, a year later, I mean, nobody talks about it because it didn't materialize for several reasons. In the part of the world where I work, I mean, the reason why this has not, one thing is sort of the availability of vaccines, but even if they were available, I mean, I cannot get my head around how you would distribute Pfizer and Moderna in the Sahel. Due to how they need to be stored, the temperature, it's simply not a vaccine that is very apt or adapted to these kind of circumstances. It's simply not possible. I mean, the vaccine that you probably could have distributed, there would have been the Russian Sputnik, but because it demands much, you can store it at around, I think it's 5 degrees below zero, whereas Pfizer and Moderna demands 30 below zero. The Russians, so they could have taken this if they wanted to. The vaccine is good, but I mean, they don't have the administrative or industrial capacity to do this. The US vaccines are not very fitted for this purpose, so this didn't materialize. And then the question is, would people take them? Because, I mean, it's not only that Africa is not getting vaccines. I mean, South Africa delivered back vaccines recently, threw away a lot because either they are not able to distribute, or people don't want them. There is vaccine skepticism also in large parts of Africa. I don't know how people would react in the Sahel if vaccines became widely available, but we have seen anti-vaccines riots in this part of the world previously, in Nigeria, in Niger, and so on. And I wouldn't be surprised if we would see it again. So it's a much more complicated question than only this, that COVAX is not getting enough vaccines. It's more complicated than that. But I think the question that you ask, would we then be able to give Malians who live in areas that are now more or less totally controlled by people we define as the terrorists, because we define them as terrorists because they claim some sort of allegiance to Al-Qaeda or to the Islamic State, even if none of them are, they are not operational branches in an Al-Qaeda or IS network. I mean, this is more about branding than being operational branches. But would we deliver? I mean, that's a very good question. And could we deliver? I think it would be possible to negotiate access to these areas with the jihadi. They have never come out as they talk about COVID, and but they have not said anything that they are against vaccines. So that would probably be possible. The question is, would we be willing to do this? Would we allow Malian governments and Malian actors to negotiate this kind of vaccine access if vaccines were available that could be distributed there? You cannot do this with Moderna and Pfizer. Maybe you could do it with Sputnik, maybe with some of these Chinese. I don't know about what level of temperature they demand. I'm not certain we would. I have a feeling that France would not, could say no to this, because they're saying no to negotiations. That's the red line. No negotiations is what France is saying. So they are also, in a way, are in opposition to all these local access negotiations that we're currently seeing. But if one wanted to do this, you would need to do it on a much larger level, not with local commanders, but it would have to be with the leaders of the jihadi insurgencies. And I'm not at all certain that France would accept it.
Okay.
Maybe I'm wrong, but so far, I mean, they have been extremely strict on this line.
Is the MSF person still there?
No, I don't think so. But that would be a shocking, yeah.
I mean, I don't know, but I am not certain that this would be something that would go down well with Macron.
Can I just add one element?
Yeah. Sorry.
I just wanted to add one element to all of this, very specifically on all the ifs, and I take all the ifs with you. There's a funding clause in USAID funding agreements for the Lake Chad area that requires additional authorization whenever any assistance is provided to people who are perceived as affiliated. So I think that immediately also raised another possible area of concern. Really, it's medical care. Someone's coming to me in need of medical care, and I have to hold on and then go back to your USAID and get the green light to provide medical care. So we're seeing a number of moments where these restrictions, either legal, contractual or political, are, as Christoph, pushing against what should be a bright red line on our side as practitioners in terms of medical care.
I agree.
Christoph has a project on red lines. That's
Thank you. Maria, you had a question?
Yes, thanks a lot, all of you, for sharing from your respective work. It's interesting to hear about sort of, how this plays out quite differently. I actually wanted to pick up again on your question, Jan, on what you asked about in the end of the previous session, on various efforts being built down to maybe prioritize more humanitarian aid. And Elling, you already responded a little bit to this, saying this plays out maybe differently in Somalia, that there the focus has been on state building, perhaps because precisely that is what has been the primary need. But I'm wondering also how this, because thinking about, on the one hand, that is what we see more funds channeled through the humanitarian programs, perhaps because precisely it's seen as the channel that is less political. And it's being seen as at least we're doing something. Well, we're giving more funds. And you, Morten, you mentioned that sometimes there's not the capacity to absorb it. So, and this and it remind me of an older project that we developed together with CMI and NUPI a few years back on the extent to which humanitarian aid or programs, whether money from humanitarian donors or organizations, are also used as a means to other ends. Humanitarian actors will want to preserve their neutrality and impartiality. At the same time, it might be talked about by governments as one tool in the toolbox in order to influence various states and actors in their direction. So I'm just wondering also a little bit how this in light of our previous session and the concrete experiences of the humanitarian organizations with how they relate to the restrictions on imposed by the counter-terrorism measures on the one hand, and then how the fact that there are large funds channeled through these programs, but perhaps also with an aim to achieve something else. And if that sparks any reactions from your perspective.
Could I just use my prerogative as a chair to just also add a little comment? So what I think quite a lot of member states that have been providing support to security sector reform and so forth, they scored a kind of a victory a few years ago with OECD when they could categorize that aid as development aid. And so how is the state building funding that you're talking about? How is it actually, what is it composed of? If it's increasing, is it, the detention center? Is it kind of support to the national army? Is it support to their counterterrorism activities? Then it's not really state building or it's more like, it's not at least a liberal kind of, state building that I was thinking of. Anyway.
First, let me respond based on the Somali case. State building for Norway has primarily been around financial management, building a central bank, Ministry of Finance, that type of thing. And that was really something that was from scratch. I started this in 2012. There was a central bank, but there was no bank account. There was nothing. So it was from scratch. And that has been a key feature of Norwegian state building, also in the case of South Sudan. It's finance. Palestine, also finance. And associated activities, Bureau of Statistics, and that sort of things. And that I've done bilaterally, and then, roped in the World Bank and so on to expand on what the Norwegians originally developed and designed. And you've done other things, but there Norway has more been a provider of funds rather than being actively involved, supporting the UNDP and so on to work on decentralization, links between member states, central government, constitutional reform, that sort of things. But if there's one thing that stands out, it's in Norwegian case, it's the financial management. There's been very little around security sector reform on the Norwegian case. There has been some, but rather modest. And where it has been linked to police, civilian components of that, because then you can tap into the aid budget. It's military, it's more difficult because then you have to tap into the Ministry of Defense, and there's a competition for access to those resources. And the Somali case, I think, illustrates my point that when you have a long-term engagement, and Somalia is formally defined as one of Norway's partner countries, that has forced them to think more long-term and to emphasize much more that humanitarian aid would have to be linked to development aid. I've been struggling to find a way to do that, but I mean, at the political level and in the strategy documents, it's emphasized quite strongly. But if I should end my response to that, I mean, I'll just alert you to the most recent state budget, which contained a quite dramatic cut in Norway's humanitarian aid budget. What was the figure? 40%. And that cut was used to expand another budget line, and that was international migration and reintegration, which is also a kind of a link to Norwegian needs, how do you keep people from entering Norway as asylum seekers and refugees. That is, we don't really know what that means because it hasn't been operationalized. I just cut down the humanitarian aid budget and expanded the budget line for migration and reintegration, and that happened, it's happening now.
Thank you, Erling. And I think we have reached our allotted time, so we have to end there. Fortunately, I think we had a few more questions in the audience. But I would like to thank all the panelists for their contributions and their very insightful comments, and the audience also for their questions and comments. So thank you all.
And to this panel. Now, as you move down, we have about 15 minutes before we have finish with our lunch break. This last 15 minutes in the program is just called a wrap up, and I intend to keep that quite informal, but it is the occasion to bring sort of if there were other questions now at the end, or questions that have been lingering from some of the other sessions yesterday or today, this is an opportunity now to bring these threads together a bit, and also perhaps hear from both of you joining us online and those of you in the room, whether you're researchers or working with this from a practitioner side. What you would think based on this discussion? What do you think? What would you encourage us as researchers to continue to keep our eyes on when discussing how these things come together? We have the project that Kristoffer is leading that is about to start, where Emanuela is also a partner on humanitarian negotiations, and how there are red lines that are being set, or gray zones in which we can negotiate. How can we think about these different frameworks that are affecting humanitarian action so deeply, which we heard very concretely from our colleagues from the humanitarian organizations this morning. So any sort of thoughts or questions that you would like to bring up now for us to sort of keep in mind going forward, or feedback back to those of you practitioners who are here with us, if there are any thoughts that we would like you to continue to bring with you, or conversations that we can continue. I can say a few words of sort of trying to sum up some of the things that I noted along the way, and some key quotes that I think sum up different parts of the discussion. But please just do raise your hand, and Emily, if you have any other questions from the audience, you just let me know. So just give me a sign if there is any other questions that you have. But some sentences that sort of stayed with me from both, especially this morning and this last session now, is one that Ida formulated. I'm roughly repeating what more or less what she said, but saying that where she said that if we are stating that families and children of IS or ISIL members are less worthy of humanitarian aid, that is simply a breach of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law and the ideas of providing humanitarian aid. So that sort of illustrates how deeply ingrained this is with the core idea of delivering humanitarian aid. Are we going to start and put categories around who is more or less worthy of accessing humanitarian aid? Then we have also what is fully expected, and how things how we know things are with our diplomat colleagues. So with Carl Salikat, who reminded that Norway does not negotiate with terrorists, full stop. That is the policy, that is sort of his red line, that's what they need to relate to. Another sentence that Elling mentioned afterwards, also referring back to the context of South Africa, way before 9/11, and sort of what we now think of when we think about terrorists. When you mentioned that someone's freedom fighter is someone else's terrorist. And I think that's been true for a long time, but it's a relationship to keep in mind still.
And then something that Morten Bøås also mentioned about corruption, how to relate to corruption as a phenomenon, and how to relate to precisely restrictions or mandates or reporting procedures that are intended to prevent from engaging in or allowing corruption. And you said something like, well, if you want to do something at all in Mali, and if you want to avoid the country from collapsing, and if you want to engage, well, you need to look away from or accept that corruption will be, and that there will be some level of corruption, and that's corruption as one specific thing. But I think we can extrapolate that also to counter-terrorism measures. What is the material support to a terrorist organization, as our colleagues earlier this morning from the humanitarian organizations showed us, and the very concrete example that you opened up with, Trude, we can picture that material and financial support to a terrorist organization defined as such is one thing, but what does it make when some humanitarian officials take part in a meeting with a local organization who also want to challenge and then actually make some change locally? They take part in a meeting with others who are defined as being members of a terrorist organization. What do these measures then do in terms of preventing a dialogue that should be perhaps, yeah. So this is also to use this. I think we can both have a concrete idea about what's big scale corruption that we don't want to happen with international donors' money, and what sort of informal, what comes with an informal economy on the one hand, but also to extrapolate this with the counter-terrorism measures. There's something very concrete about supporting an organization defined as such, and well, interacting in the country where there are links between different local actors. And also, Elling, yes, you finished. Thank you for mentioning also an example that is closer to my own research with the shift around. That's also a little bit what I have in mind when thinking about humanitarian means to other ends. But also when very concretely when you mention now that the humanitarian aid budget is reduced, and at the same time another part of the budget is increased, and that and I think that's and Antonio also mentioned yesterday, even if it's something we've discussed a little bit less, but the fear of the terrorist threats, the abstract or concrete terrorist threat, definitely affects migration policies and refugee protection very concretely as well. So that's also something to bear in mind when we think about how these measures affect a lot of different areas of humanitarian aid provision and protection to vulnerable populations. Are there any questions or thoughts that you would like to share before we break for lunch? Yes, please. And then Emanuele, would you like to come up here, and you can also go.
Thank you. Me again from the United States, and I'm not a diplomat anymore. I don't speak for the United States, but I just wanted to mention that, well, the United States has been talked about quite a bit here in terms of U.S. policy, and like the representative of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry said, I don't think there's going to be change, that Americans are going to ask their government, their president, and the U.S. Congress is going to demand that American lives and be protected against terrorists. So that it won't be called war on terrorism maybe by the Biden administration, but that foreign policy agenda item will remain. So how do we work within that to accomplish the other goals? And I mentioned Samantha Power. I think she's got certainly credibility as the new director of Agency for International Development to try to get scarce resources that the American people have have paid through taxes to the right people. And that's why I mentioned the issue of corruption, because she and her team in AID is working with that very issue of trying to be more efficient in getting scarce dollars to the people who need it. And the American people, I think, do respond to that. And I think, Eugenia, I think you mentioned that there has been some changes, some licenses granted, general and specific yesterday. So there is change going on. And then the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, one of the first things he did was try to talk about how do we help others. And there has been a shift from the Trump administration. And now President Biden, December 10th, will host a summit in Washington on democracy. And that means defending against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, protecting respect for human rights. And so that's the context of what's happening in U.S. foreign policy. So, and I think, and also about the COVID, President Biden has, I forget how many millions of doses that are going to be donated to different countries around the world, including Africa. So there's change going on. So how do you, and I think that there are people in both the administration and U.S. Congress who are open to the agenda we have here today of trying to get help, assistance through the various organizations that have been represented here today to the right people. And so, again, I'm not speaking for the U.S. government, but I think there is change going on, and hopefully we can continue to the messaging to the people in the U.S. administration, U.S. Congress, the American people can be in a way that supports that objective we all have of getting scarce resources, whether it's medicine or humanitarian assistance to the right people. So thank you. This has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep. Yes, Emanuela, please.
With trepidation, I take the floor again, because I've talked a lot and I really want to be invited back.
Yes, we're very happy that you do.
But I'm going to talk one last time, because there's a genie we need to put back in a bottle. And what is it? It's the genie of no contact. And I'm picking up on something you said, Maria, because you were talking about material support, which is a term that we bandy around, and there's a correct moment for referring to material support. And that is when an entity has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the Department of State. That brings into force the Material Support Act. And that's where we have this horrible, horrible definition, which is material support is any property, tangible or intangible, including currency or monetary instruments, financial security, services, lodging, training, expert advice or assistance, safe houses, false documentation or identification, and so on and so on and so forth. So that applies if either as a matter of law, you are directly bound by US sanctions, or through a contract have agreed to comply with them. And therefore, an entity has been designated as such. Then it's fine for us to refer to material support. Otherwise, no. And then let's just follow the very limited prohibitions that we see in sanctions, which are on making funds or assets available. Even when material support statute is applicable to you, there is no prohibition as a matter of law on contact. We can and we must have contact. There's no prohibition as a matter of law. I think what we are seeing is that there might be efforts to prevent this for political reasons. There may be heavy-handed interventions by the local police forces, as we see in Nigeria. But that's when we need to have common positions, red lines as humanitarians to push back against it. So let's try and put this genie of no contact back in the bottle where it belongs.
Thank you very much, Emanuela. Unless there are other comments, I think that was a very good concluding comment. And thank you for reminding precisely of the specifics here, and both the specific definition, if we can call it a specific definition, because that is the definition, but as you show us, it is very extensive as well. And at the same time, reminding us of the very important, which you also very clearly showed us yesterday by standing up, that there is no prohibition on contact, even if it de facto sometimes becomes experienced as such, or that is how it is practiced, but that's a very helpful reminder. So thank you also for giving us that legal framework. Then I will just conclude by thanking you all so much for coming and for contributing actively to our discussions, to all our panelists from yesterday and today. Big thank you to the organizing committee, so Christopher and Aisha, who is with us online, for a lot of work the last couple of weeks preparing this program. Big thanks to Toyota and the communication department for helping facilitate the event, as well as Emily and Caroline. We have also elaborated this program together with Antonio and with Stein from NUPI, who couldn't be here today. And we very much look forward to seeing you for more events next year, hoping we can continue to meet in person, but it will likely be hybrid options also for quite some time going forward. So stay tuned also on our both social medias, I should say, and on our very new website, which really looks very nice, and it's a whole other reading experience, hopefully, to access the things that we share from our different projects there. So the website is very easy to remember. It's humanitarianstudies.no. And you can also feel free to serve yourselves from our different publications in the back relating to different aspects that we have been discussing these 2 days. I think lunch is served back there, so please stay around and hang out over lunch with us. And thanks again so much for coming. And thanks all for joining us online as well.